Okie dokie, here we go with Module 3. I can tell it's been a while since I've talked for a long time because I'm very quickly losing my voice. Whew, out of practice. Okay, so for Module 3, what we're going to talk about is what in the world is an FIE, an IEP, an FBA, and a BIP or a BIP? And what in the world does that mean to me? All right, so an FIE is a full and individual evaluation. We have already talked quite a bit about a full and individual evaluation, but the part that we haven't talked about it is that not only is it the evaluation that happens when a student is referred for an evaluation for special education, but there's also a report that comes at the end of it. And this report is very important, especially if they qualify. Even if they don't qualify, there's a lot of good information in there for you as a teacher, but especially if they qualify, because the report contains their eligibilities, it contains some recommendations and suggestions that are based on that student's evaluation findings. The report contains information about cognitive, achievement, behavioral, and emotional strengths and weaknesses that we found during the evaluation. Both the FIE and the IEP documents are going to be housed on your campus. You're not going to get a full copy of both of those for privacy purposes, but there is always going to be a complete full document of both of those housed on your campus. Most of the time it's housed in the office area, sometimes in the special education teacher's room. You will need to contact either your counselor or probably your special education teacher is the one who will know. And I would highly recommend at the beginning of the school year that you make time, take a day or take a morning or whatever, and go and read through your students' full FIE and IEP. Or if that is just overwhelming to you, contact your diagnostician and ask them for help and see if they will help you kind of interpret the FIE and the eligibility and what are the cognitive strengths and weaknesses of this kid? What makes them tick? I've had several ARD meetings I've sat in, and it's been, February, and I've gone through that, they've said, I just can't, they do great on their daily work, but when it comes to testing, we just cannot seem to remember anything. And I'll go back and look at the FIE and I'll say, well, there's a reason for that. He has, a really, really poor long-term retrieval. He scored a 60 in long-term retrieval. And the teacher will look at me and go, well, I wish I'd have known that at the beginning of the year. We could have approached this completely differently. So if you'll take a little bit of time at the beginning of the year and look at your students' reports and kind of get to know them ahead of time, you may be able to start the year completely different with them and help them to have a really good school year just by knowing where their strengths and weaknesses are, especially cognitively and behaviorally. And it may make your school year completely different than it might have been. Okay, the IEP. The IEP is an individual education plan. This is what's written at the initial ARD once a student is admitted into special education. They are, as it sounds, they are individual per student, written specifically for their needs. They are reviewed annually at the annual ARD meeting, and these are legally binding documents. These are not suggestions. So when you get your list of accommodations STAR accommodations, all the goals. These are not suggestions, okay? And if it's on there, we have to do it. Absolutely have to do it. And you have to document that you've been doing it. And if we don't do it, we can get in a lot of trouble. So if it's an accommodation that you think is not relevant anymore, then contact me or contact your special education teacher, and we can always see about doing an amendment and taking it off. So we don't have to keep that on there, but you have to do it if it's on there. All right, let's talk about the different components of an IEP. So IEP is going to list what their eligibility is, what the disability is, and when the new testing is needed. It'll have the PLAF, which is their present levels of academic functioning. And it'll list basically their curriculum, behavioral, functional needs. It's going to have their accommodations and supports that are required for them, any testing decisions that have been made state and district-wide. And then it's going to have their schedule of services and placement. And that is going to include stuff like what their schedule is, their placement being how much time they spend in general education versus special education. So resource versus general education class, if they go to content mastery, if they're in functional academics, that kind of stuff. It'll also list if they take speech or if they go to OT or if they get pulled out for social skills class. All that kind of information is going to be listed right here for schedule of services. Okay, your expertise and information is not only very valued, but it's mandatory by law. So that's why you have to have a general ed representative at each ARD meeting, and why we are required to gather information from our teachers prior to. Okay, so general ed teachers are all going to get a copy of the goals. These are written by special ed teachers for the annual ARD meeting. And then they're going to be reported on every 6 weeks, but you are going to need to collect data to help report on these goals. So your special ed teacher is going to check in with you before the end of the 6 weeks. They're reported on concurrently with report cards. And so you're going to need to be collecting data to help give feedback on these goals. You're also going to get a copy of classroom accommodations. These are things like extra time on test, preferential seating, oral administration of test, things like that. These accommodations should either reflect the eligibility or they have to have data to support the need. Example, if a student has a specific learning disability in reading comprehension, they are not automatically going to get a calculator. Can't do it. That's not their eligibility. Now, if after a lot of data is taken, and we have tried many interventions and they are still having lots and lots and lots of trouble, then we could maybe try a calculator, but we're going to have a lot of data to support the validity of needing a calculator. So just because a kid's in special education doesn't mean they're automatically going to be able to get all the accommodations. All the accommodations are available to them eventually if they're needed and if there is data to support the need. Make sense? So if it's their eligibility, then yes, right away they're eligible for it. So had her eligibility been math calculation, sure, she gets a calculator right out of the hat because that's her eligibility. But if not, then we're going to have some pretty hardcore data saying, look, we've tried and we've done this and we've done that, and we are still not making headway. And here's why we think that having a calculator would be beneficial to her making progress in the classroom. Okay? All right, STAR accommodations. These accommodations must be implemented regularly in the classroom setting before it can be used as a STAR accommodation. So if you want to have extra time on the STAR test, then you have to be offering extra time in the classroom as a classroom accommodation. If you want to have the STAR test orally read to the student, then all tests have to be orally read in the classroom as an accommodation. We can't justify offering accommodation on STAR all of a sudden if it's not needed regularly in the classroom. So there's that. Behavior intervention plan. If the student has one, you will receive a copy of that. And I'll explain here in a little while of what exactly a behavior intervention plan is. Okay, teacher summaries for IEPs. Prior to the annual ARD, teacher summaries, or what we call our competency forms, will be sent out to all the staff that the child has for data collection. Teacher summaries are collected by the special education teachers for the development of the IEP. All input is valued. All teachers who interact with the student in an educational setting, core or elective, must contribute. Teacher summaries are reviewed by the diagnostician and administration, and they're read at the ARD meeting. Okay, you need to answer all the questions that are on there. There's informal and formal information that goes in there. And then share any concerns with the current IEP, behavior, self-advocacy, functional skills, any concerns. This is the time to share the new concerns and not all of a sudden at the ARD in front of the parent for the first time. If there's concerns that we need to deal with and talk about and come up with solutions for, please bring it to the special education teacher, to the administrator, to me prior to the meeting so that we can have a discussion and come up with some sort of game plan solution before we're all just sitting there in the ARD meeting staring, deer in headlights trying to figure out something on the fly. That looks very unprofessional for us to do that. And if there's a problem, we want to be able to offer a solution. Okay? All right, I mentioned this earlier. If you want to make changes to an IEP before the annual ARD, it can be done two ways. Through an ARD amendment, and this is where a committee does not meet in person, but it's just agreed upon by phone or by email. And just about anything can be changed through an ARD amendment. Most of the time it's accommodations or STAR accommodations that are changed. To a revision ARD. And this is where a committee would meet for a brief ARD. There are a few things that an ARD committee has to meet in person for. These would be eligibility determinations. So if a student, if it had been requested for extra testing to add on an additional eligibility, we would have to meet in person to do that in between annual ARDs. Change of placement, that would be amount of time spent in general ed versus special ed. For example, we've had students who were in functional academics and general ed classes, and they were in, say, 4 general ed classes and 4 functional academic classes. And they got into that school year and discovered it was overwhelming. And so they decided, we want to reduce the amount of time in general education and increase the amount of time in functional academics. We want to switch out 2 of the general ed classes for functional academic. Well, that would change the placement. That would change the amount of time spent in special education classes versus gen ed. So we would have to meet in person to do that because that's changing their placement. We also have to meet in person for what's called a manifestation determination. These are meetings where a student has, there's been some sort of major behavioral issue. Oftentimes, they have spent time in ISS. This is a special education student. If they have spent 10 days in ISS, then we have to meet in person and determine, is their behavior a manifestation of their disability, or is their behavior, their actions, something that they can control outside of their disability? So we have to meet for those, and there's different repercussions determining on the outcome of that meeting. So those are basically the three things that we have to meet in person for brief ARDs in between annual ARD meetings. Anything else can be taken care of through an ARD amendment. All right, things to know: no staff member can unilaterally change the IEP. If you want to change it, first thing you need to do, if you want to propose a new accommodation or you want to delete an accommodation, first thing to do is contact the parent. Make sure it's okay with the parent. If they agree to that, then contact me or your diagnostician on your campus and let us know what day you contacted the parent, that they agreed to it, how you contacted the parent, by phone, email, whatever, and then what the changes that you would like to make. And then we can type up that amendment real fast and get that out there, and bada bing, bada boom, real simple. All right, and the ARD committee ultimately determines appropriate accommodations and supports together as a committee. Okay, FBA, a functional behavior analysis. Not very many of our kids end up having to go through one of these. This happens only to kids who are in special education. If you are not in special education, this does not apply to you, and this would not happen during an initial evaluation. You already have to have a standing eligibility as a special education student. But this would be a kid who's having trouble in the classroom, with behavior, maybe even outside the classroom, playground or whatever. Anyway, some sort of behavior that is really affecting the student at school. And the FBA is an approach to figure out why a student acts a certain way. It uses different methods, interviews, observation, task analysis to understand what's behind behavior challenges. The basic idea is that a student's behavior serves a purpose. Whether or not they know it, kids act certain ways for a reason. If schools and families can understand what's causing a behavior, they can find ways to change it. So our LSSPs, licensed psychologist, would spend some time with the kid in different settings, classrooms, collecting data on the student. And that's going to help narrow down what the specific problem behaviors are, what the antecedent is, what's causing it, and then what the consequence of that behavior is, whether good or bad, and how we can then alter the surroundings to create better behavior, a better outcome. So then they would report on that FBA, and we would develop then what's called a behavior intervention plan. And that behavior intervention plan, or BIP, would become a part of the IEP. Now the BIP would include the FBA in it. I did not include that on this slide because the FBA usually is about 20 pages long, and so I did not think you would want to sift through all that today. But the BIP then is going to look like this. This is actually a BIP for one of our students. The BIP is going to cover who is responsible for implementing this plan. And so you can see all the different people who are going to be involved with the BIP. And then it's going to talk about what behaviors we're going to address, how we're going to address them, what environment we're going to address where at, what it's going to look like, how we're going to structure the environment, strategies, what the reward system will be, and what the consequences will be. Now, this right here, this target behavior is linked then to a new goal that has been set in the goal section of the IEP. So it's all linked together, and so you would get a new copy of goals, a behavior goal that had been set. And so here would be a second targeted behavior. And again, this is all in response to the FBA information that had been gathered and what was found on it. They narrowed down the most disruptive behaviors that this particular student had been displaying, and they came up with these strategies, and this kid had a turnaround in less than a month using these strategies. So BIPs can be, FBAs and BIPs can be amazing when utilized correctly and when everyone is on board for it. So if you have a student who is just really digging in and having a rough time, talk to your LSSP and see if a BIP might be in order. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Sometimes simply doing social skills would be appropriate. Sometimes doing some counseling would be appropriate. There's lots of different ways we can approach it and give you assistance in the classroom setting. So don't be afraid though to reach out to your student service crew on your campus for help. That's what we're there for. All right, that wraps up Module 3, and go take another potty break, get some coffee, and we'll be back for our last module, Module 4, here in just a second.